Thank you very much, Nico. For those who don't know me, I'm Tim Besley. I'm a member of the economics department at LSE, and I'll be chairing this event. The panel will come up on stage in a moment. I'll introduce the topic momentarily, and then I'll describe how we're going to approach this. First of all, hearty congratulations to the organisers for putting together what is going to be an excellent, or is an excellent event, and very timely, as Nico emphasised. So we have a panel now on rekindling Britain's economic flame. I was struck by the fact that one could have had a panel of this variety at almost any point in the post-war period. And the interesting question is whether it would have had different or similar content. We'll only learn that as we listen to our speakers and to the debate today. Almost everybody agrees that Britain has a problem with investment. Investment in skills, investment in technology, in infrastructure, and in physical capital. These are all long-standing observations about the UK economy. But it's not a very helpful observation because these are all symptoms. They're not causal factors. They ultimately end up in a relatively poor economic performance. Our productivity levels have generally lagged behind other economies with whom we compare ourselves. There was a brief period in the long sweep of history when Britain, between somewhere like 1980 and the onset of the financial crisis, was converging back to other leading economies. But by and large, the story of the British economy has been one of a lot of hand-wringing and disappointment over most of the period since it emerged as a leader, but that was probably 2 centuries ago. So the question is very timely. What can we do, and what can we do now, and what are the core policy prescriptions that would come out of that? There's much discussion of the structural factors that shape Britain's economic performance. Are they policy-based? Are they to do with the nature of our economy, the fact that we were technological and first mover, technological leader and first mover at some point became at some point a disadvantage to us. I am struck by cycles of views. My favorite example is to read, and I don't imagine many people in the room have read the Macmillan report of the mid-1930s, which was a report on the capital market in the UK and how poorly it served medium-sized firms. What was done by government in response to that was a lot of warm words, but it's very hard to point to anything very specific that happened. Many of these themes just come and go. The other theme that I think is as close as we have to a national embarrassment is our inadequate attempts to deal with skills, particularly in the bottom third of the distribution. That's not a new issue. Many governments have tried to tackle that over the years with a moderate, at best moderate degree of success. But everyone, and I'm sure the panelists will have, their own views of what are the structural features. What, is it in the schooling system? Is it in the planning system? Is it in some other area of government? Or is it just the way the private sector operates in the UK? Could it be even cultural? We'll be learning about all of that as we go. So the way we're going to run the panel is that in a moment we're going to hear from Lord David Sainsbury, who's a former member of the House of Lords, Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. He has some slides, so the panel is going to remain seated so that we can enjoy those without stressing our necks, having to look behind us. At that point, the panel will assemble, and in the order in which they will speak, I'll first turn to Anton Howes, who's head of innovation research at the Entrepreneurs Network, a prolific author and a historian of invention, and so we'll hear from him. We'll then hear from Professor Deirdre McCloskey, who's distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics and of History at the University of Illinois Chicago, again well known for her writings on a wide range of historical and issues around the importance of liberal thought in the whole of the story of the development of the economy. And then finally, our sweeper is Andy Haldane, who's Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Arts, who will then reflect on what has been said. And at that point, we'll have a bit of a discussion among the panel, and then I'll turn it over to the audience, and we'll have a general discussion. So without further delay, let me invite David Sainsbury to come to the podium and every speaker will speak for about 5 minutes, and then so we should have plenty of time for the discussion.
Thank you very much. I find late in life that I've probably spent the last 40 years producing various policy documents, pamphlets about economic growth. And one of the things that I discovered in that process was that the first thing to do, if you're going to produce a policy on anything, is to understand what the problem is. How do you think the system or the process or the organization should run? Why is it not running like that? And then you can start saying, that's the problem and that's why we should put it right. So in talking about economic growth, I think the first thing to understand is what is the problem? And that's what I'm going to try and address in the next few minutes, so that we can then understand what the problem is. I think this is a good place to start, which is looking at the productivity trend of G7 countries over this period from 1973 through to 2013. And what you'll see is that all G7 countries have been having declining rates of economic growth over this period, particularly from about 1990 onwards. They've all been declining. And I think that has one very clear implication, which is this is not particularly about the policies or tax policies of any particular country. It's something that has impacted all the G7 countries. And the question is, what is that? What is also interesting about the declining rates of growth is that economists are unable to give an agreed view of what was the cause of this declining rates of economic growth. You can see it ranges from human capital, labour market factors, low demand, and there is even a group which thinks it's all about mismeasurement. I'm going to say that it's none of those things, it's something different. One of the other, of course, arguments, which is what Tyler Cohen talked about last night, is that we are on some kind of technological plateau. I have to say I find that a very difficult argument to go along with, because if you just look at what are the technological opportunities taking place now, it's very difficult to see any sector which is not subject to technological change and opportunities that come from this. Energy, information technology, transport, all of them seem to be having technological opportunities. And so in that sense, I think it's very difficult to argue that it's a technological plateau. This rather remarkable chart, which comes from Richard Baldwin's book, The Great Convergence, I think begins to give one a clue as to what is going on. What's rather remarkable about this is it looks at, going back to the year 1000, what was the size of the GDP that China and India had, and what was the size of the world economy that G7 had. And rather remarkably, at that point, China and India had 51% of the world's economy, and G7 countries had 7%. This is, people may be surprised by this. China at this point, this was the Song dynasty, which was an extremely prosperous part of China, linked with the Silk Road to India, which was a source, of course, of great spices which had been traded with the Roman Empire. And this position of the G7 being low and China and India having a large chunk of it goes on till really the period of the Industrial Revolution, when, of course, the G7 Industrial Revolution, which starts in England, then spreads to Europe, then goes to America. And at this point, the G7 share goes up and up till about 1990, and equally China and India start coming down. What is interesting is in about 1990, the G7 percentage plateaus and then starts coming down. And having been at about 2/3, 67%, it falls, is now down to about 50%, and China and India start coming up. So the question is, what happened in 1990 which affected the G7 percentage? What changed at that particular point? And once you ask the question, it's not very difficult to know what the answer is, which is that three parts of the world economy became market economies. So in 1990, it's the first time Deng Xiaoping really begins to privatize the public sector. Then in India, Manmohan Singh starts liberalizing the Indian economy. And of course, you then have the collapse of the Russian Federation, and countries like Poland, which had been a market economy, very quickly came back to a market economy and started competing in the world economy. The other thing, of course, obviously to note, is that these are very large populations. So that when China, with over 1 billion people, becomes a market economy, the impact on the whole of the world economy is huge and has an enormous effect. So what happens, what does that show about the impact on the British economy? To understand that, you have to understand something which a lot of economists, particularly neoclassical economists, don't like to think about, which is that different sectors of the economy have very different value added per capita. Mining and quarrying, North Sea oil, has enormous GDP per capita. Financial insurance activities at £96 is also very high. Manufacturing is sort of medium level. And then down here, you will have various service industries, particularly things like furs, which have very low value added. And this is, and agriculture also, of course, very low. What is interesting about these figures is that the relationships are very common right across the world, whether you're looking at the Chinese economy or the American economy or the British economy. Financial services being very high value added, manufacturing being medium, and across the world, agriculture is low value added. Now, these are very significant because, as you will appreciate, if you start losing, if the share in your economy of manufacturing declines and is replaced by large numbers of jobs in food areas like food services, it has a very negative impact on the economy. And it's important to understand that because that is what, in fact, has been happening. This is an amazing chart, I think. It shows over this period, 1952 till, I think, 2012, what was happening to our manufacturing industry as a share of the total economy. And you can see it goes down from 35% to about 10%, where it is still now. So that has enormously negative impact on our growth rate. And of course, that is entirely due to competition from countries elsewhere in the world, often those with low wages who are recently become have become developing countries. And you can see the impact that that has on the UK economy. If you just take, if you looked at just all the different sectors over this period, it's 2010 to 2021, you would have a 15.7% increase. But because of the shift between sectors, from manufacturing to other sectors, low value added, you have a negative effect of 13.3%. And that means that your total labour productivity growth over those period was 2.4, which gives you an annual increase of 0.2%, which is obviously extremely low and very dangerous to get into that kind of area. Now, if you're in that situation where your industry is losing out on a major way to low wage cost countries around the world. The only strategy you have, the strategy of cutting wages and trying to be competitive that way, gets you nowhere. Obviously, because what you're trying to do is increase value added and not trying to make a profit simply by lowering wages. What you have to do at that point is to go into more advanced industries where potentially your scientific knowledge and skills can give you an advantage in those areas. So the question is, how do you get in, is to get into those advanced industries? And what the next chart, these are well, let me go back a bit. A very interesting organization in America called IF has looked at this particular question. And what they looked at was what percentage of each country's, well, they've looked at first, what is the percentage of these advanced industries in each, in the total world economy? And they then looked, what is the position of individual countries in this? What they found was that if you look at the if you look at the concentration of these industries in the world, it's about 8%. If you then look at individual countries, you see the ones which have the greatest concentration of advanced industries are countries like Taiwan, Korea, and Germany, Switzerland, Japan. What you would expect to see in that, China coming up quite significantly, the United States, in fact, only at just under 8%. Compare that with Taiwan at 18%. And down here, Britain at 6.6%. That means we are, if it's a question of going into advanced industries, we start from a very poor position. The only good news, whenever I show this chart, people have the same reaction. Well, at least we're still ahead of France. But other than that, there is really no good news in that slide, because getting into these advanced industries is where we have to get growth in the future. So just to sum up what I've said, I'm afraid rather quickly, is why do we have a slow rate of growth? And the answer is because we have a poor rate of innovation in advanced industries, which is the engine of economic growth. As a result, we're not producing the high value-added, innovative, world-beating products and services to produce the growth we need. If you want to just see a physical manifestation of that statement, just look around your house, look at the study, look at your garage, and look at where the products come from. If I look around my study, I find I have an Apple iPhone, I have an Apple computer, I have a Casio telephone system, and I have a Canon printer, and the watch I wear is a Swatch watch from Switzerland. Almost all my clothes come from Bangladesh. They have various labels on them, but they actually come from Bangladesh, other than my ties, which come from France, Germany, and England. I'm in fact wearing an English tie, a Dunhill tie, which is the one thing which is internationally competitive in my study. But it's very difficult to see that we can base our future economic success on selling Dunhill ties to the rest of the world. So that's the problem we have. How do we create many more high value-added, innovative, world-beating products and services to produce the growth we need? And I think the second point I've always learned about policy making is the first thing to do is to look around the world and look at who does this particularly well and what we can learn from them. This is something you always do in business, but it's rarely done, in my experience, in politics. And the point to always to understand is there's practically no problem we have which every other country in the world doesn't have also. There are two exceptions, fox hunting and hereditary peers, but other than that, the problems are the same. So if you want to do something about growth, the thing to do is to look at who has done this best. And I would argue that probably the best country to look at is Singapore, which started with very low growth in very simple industries. And by industry and government working together on what one would call industrial policies, have made themselves arguably the richest country in the world in terms of value added per capita. And you'll find in Singapore, for most of the industries, they have what they call transformation maps, which are agreed documents between the industry and government as to where that industry is going to look in terms of raising the level of value added per capita and how they're going to do it and what contribution government can make to it. So what we need to do, I think, is to target support, R&D, skills, financial support to the following sectors if they have realistic plans to increase their value added per capita. That has to be a base of it. This is not government telling industry what to do. It's saying, how can we cooperate on your plan to increase value added per capita? And what they want to do, what they should be doing, is focusing this on the medium high-tech manufacturing, green industries, and other advanced industries. And if we can do that effectively, then we have, I think, a chance of getting the economy to grow once again. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to invite the panel to assemble. I will go on the end so I can. Thank you very much. David really tabled a challenging agenda for the panel and for the day. So I'm going to turn first to Anton to give us a response in 5 minutes to what you've heard, or adding your own perspective on the challenges. So Anton, first to you.
Great, thanks very much. So we've heard what we should be learning from other countries, potentially. I'm going to ask, how do we do it in the first place? Right? If you're an extraterrestrial visiting Britain, or visiting the world in 1550, roughly, you're not going to choose England and Scotland as being the place where an industrial revolution is going to happen. You'll probably choose modern-day Belgium. You're probably going to choose maybe the Dutch Republic, what will become the Dutch Republic, so modern-day Netherlands. You might choose somewhere in China, right? These are places with big cities. They're highly urbanized. There's quite a lot of industry already. Britain, in this period, has about 3% urbanization. It's overwhelmingly agrarian. Like, basically, the only thing that we're doing is farming, keeping a bunch of sheep, growing some wool, and maybe there's a little bit of wool spinning and weaving going on as well. So how do we do it the first time? Well, I'm going to go through just very briefly, because I've only got my 5 minutes, a few things, key facts about the Industrial Revolution that a lot of people don't realize. Firstly, the Industrial Revolution was broad. Right? It's not just about the things that you immediately think of, like cotton, coal, steam, iron, steel. It's about agriculture, it's about watchmaking, it's about ceramics and landscape gardening. Anything you can think of in this period is improved, right? There are inventors who are even improving music and musical instruments. You'd be surprised to learn just how many things that we take for granted today are invented in Britain around this period, of just a few hundred years. Second thing, a lot of people kind of assume that the Industrial Revolution happens in the Midlands and the North. This is false. It happens in London first, right? Overwhelmingly, nearly all of the invention happens in London. The site of production is often elsewhere in the country. But in terms of the actual agglomeration of where everyone is and where they're inventing, where they're coming up with ideas, it starts in London and then only later spreads out to the rest of the country, right? London becomes this really key hub from extremely early on. From 1550 onwards, it goes from being a backwater, 50,000 people, I mean, barely even registering the top 20 in Europe, let alone the world. By 1700, it's 575,000 people, and it's one of the largest cities in the entire world. right? That's an extraordinary growth. Most people don't even talk about it. Like, we're talking pre-1700, right? This is one of the really big changes that happened. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we actually need to look at this earlier stage. What is going on here? Why do we have this massive growth of a particular city, which then becomes the key innovation hub, arguably in the entire world? Third, most innovation, nearly all of these innovations are incremental and they are cumulative. There is basically no such thing as a great leap forward with a lot of stuff. Sometimes people come across an incremental innovation that happens to have an outsized effect, right? So you might improve some wool spinning machinery, some linen spinning machinery, some cotton spinning machinery. It just so happens that if you improve them all by the same amount, but if you happen to improve the cotton spinning machinery, it turns out there's a much larger market for that to suddenly expand quite dramatically, right? This is the case with basically all innovation. I'd be very interested if anyone has a counterexample that I can't address, at least from this period. Anything post-1850, I have no idea what's going on. The other key thing there, though, is that nearly all of these incremental cumulative innovations are happening from people who we don't kind of typically think of as being inventors nowadays. When we think of inventors, we think of like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and hyper-rich people with huge resources at their disposal. Maybe there's the kind of mythos of starting in the garage and going from there. But like the main kind of people who innovate are basically Wallace and Gromit. It's the oddball, down the garden shed who's tinkering with stuff, comes up with an idea, and then is able to leverage that, right? It's enthusiasts with obsessions a lot of the time. Sometimes it goes beyond that. You get enthusiasts with obsessions who happen to get hired by some kind of R&D lab in a large corporation. We used to call them boffins. Whatever happened to Q and boffins? Our idea of innovation, I think, was actually a bit more realistic before. And fifthly, just very briefly, having noted these four things about the Industrial Revolution, I imagine I'm just about running out of time. Why Britain? It's going to be the question on everyone's lips. Why is it that this kind of complete backwater in 1550, roughly, ends up being the place that by 1900 is basically the world's Saudi Arabia for coal, it's the world's New York for finance, it's the world's China for manufacturing, right? How do you go from backwater to that? Essentially, I think one thing to note here is that innovators are incredibly rare. Like very, very few people were responsible for nearly all of those advances. But in Britain, those very, very few people, who are kind of all over the place, they really managed to create the conditions for success as a group. Because they're concentrated in London, they're particularly organised. But at the same time, you have a very, very weak court, right? If you're trying to get some money from the king in 1603, 1604, in this kind of early period, it's going to be pretty tough because the king is pretty broke a lot of the time. And what you have instead is a very decentralized system where they're essentially kind of creating a robust system of support. There's a broader class of merchants, aristocrats, gentry that they are appealing to. And that creates a vested, continuing interest in innovation by a broad spectrum of elites. There's that word from yesterday again. Which in turn, interestingly, when you try to appeal to a broad group of people rather than just a few people, it leads to openness, right? You end up selectively revealing a lot of techniques, which ends up in turn spreading innovation further because you have this kind of norm of openness that develops. Finally, I'm just going to kind of end on just this one note. There's a lot of hand-wringing that goes on, and Tim, you mentioned, we could have had this talk 50 years ago. That's good. Right? That was the case in 1550 when everyone's panicking about all these crises and they think, you know what, how about we get Sebastian Cabot over? He knows all about navigation and that suddenly turns Britain into a maritime nation, having been effectively not a maritime nation before that. It's good because in 1851 they think, oh my God, the French are catching up with us. Let's hold the Great Exhibition and try to stay ahead and figure out why we're staying ahead. Right? This kind of paranoia about falling behind is actually what made Britain kind of great in the first place. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anton. And I'm going to turn to Deirdre McCloskey now for her perspective, which I imagine will be historical too. But
yes, it is. I always agree with Anton. I was on his PhD committee. And to speak historically, I've been making the kind of point that he's making from before he was born. My first venture of this sort was on the iron and steel industry in the late 19th century in Britain. And that was not that was in 1968. So I've been arguing, as Anton does, that the key point here is individual opportunity, individual creativity. And that theme has been rather lost in the discussions we're having here and in the discussions outside this room. And the problem is perhaps that we ask how we can improve growth in this country and others. We heard from we heard from Tyler last night that it depends, that is, growth depends on innovation at the frontier that he once saw as slowing. Now he's changed his mind. We just heard that it's structure, that it's because we're doing too damn many services on that point. I would say that we choose to do too damn many services. To say that that's the source of our woe would be like arguing that housework, which isn't at all figured in the national income, is a drain on productivity. We should stop taking care of children, or indeed having them, because that's not the internationally competitive frontier. I suppose you wouldn't claim that the British are extremely good at producing children. So, and international competitiveness, I would argue, and if we had more time we could get into it in detail, is a nonsense as a goal for a country. Trade is determined by comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. To be sure, absolute advantage, which is how well you do what you do, is nice, is a very good thing to have. And we should do more and more of that. Do much better at having children and much better at oil in the North Sea. But it's individual choice that we value, I say, in the West, but as was observed, you observed, the Chinese and the Indians, by turning first in 1978 and then in 1991 to more individual choice, suddenly started growing like mad. The largest migration in human history happened in China, people moving from the interior to work in the factories and construction on the coast. India too, which we once said was stuck in the Asian dilemma, hopeless case. In fact, this was true, said to be also true of China, are now doing very well. And the problem with the Singapore model is that tyrants, which is what Singapore is, it's a tyranny, usually screw up. And that's what's happening now in both China and India, alas. Let's hope it turns around. So I would claim that the way Britain became rich and the way the world became rich was, in a word, liberalism, understood as equality of permission. As you all say in this country, this mad sporting country as you are. I myself am mad about cricket. We started to allow people to have a go. In Australia, they say fair goes. And that fundamental idea that all men and women, dear, are created equal in permission, equal in being allowed to run the race, not equal in outcome, which, if that's imposed by us, by the we, is a catastrophe, and not equal in opportunity even, which is unattainable. Some of us had excellent parents. I chose mine extremely carefully. My father was a professor at Harvard. My mother was an opera singer. Wow, I deserve a high income. You can see that right away. Some of us are fortunate in that connection, some not so much. How are we to equalize opportunity? Are we to, like the Spartans, take away the boys from their mother at age 7, rather the way of English public schools, by the way, and train the boys as the Spartanate? No, I don't think so. Free economies work better. And the solution, one very important point. I've been arguing for half a century that this lugubrious talk that the British people indulge in since the fall of the empire. We're just a tiny island, and woe is me, woe is me. You're still one of the richest countries in the world. You're among the thoroughbreds. And it's at least impolite to focus on, we're not as good as the Germans right now, and whoa, when there are real non-thoroughbreds with incomes a 10th or a 20th of yours. So I've been saying this for 50 years. It's had no impact, but I say it again, stop it for Lord's sake. Let people be free. Allow them to run the race. Let women become airline pilots. Let people turn agricultural land into housing. Let people start a new hairdressing salon in the neighborhood if they want to. Allow people to do those services that you think are so essential to our lives. You do that and you get economic growth. It's not the government that made for economic growth. It's not the we. Whenever I hear state-private cooperation, I think of corruption and rent-seeking. I do not believe that it's the responsibility of any government to choose who's to win or who's to lose. So, government by the people, or let's express it way, an economy by the people, of the people, for the people, as our great poet and president said, is an economy of equality, of permission alone. Thank you.
Okay, Andy, so your job is to catalyze a discussion and to comment on everything that's been heard so far and distill that, as well as giving us your own views.
Very good. Thank you, Tim, in 5 minutes. Lovely. Surrounded left and right by eminent historians, I will also take a historical lens, although a narrower historical lens, and I want to talk about what I did yesterday. What did you do yesterday, Andy, is the question I hear absolutely no one asking. So let me tell you, I got on a train, went to Sheffield for the launch of the South Yorkshire, the first investment zone in the UK. Mm-hmm. And I came back buoyed by that experience, optimistic. So Sheffield, South Yorkshire has been a part of the Great Stagnation. But I came back thinking it could be part of the Great Regeneration, not just of South Yorkshire, but beyond. Mm-hmm. So let me give you 5 reasons, 5 factors that aren't Sheffield specific, why I came back buoyed by that experience. It might be ingredients for regen more generally. 1, local leadership. Without local leadership, there will not be local growth, and without local growth, there will be no national growth. South Yorkshire has a newish mayor. The investment zones have achieved a degree of glue within the region. You know, what's sometimes called the People's Republic of South Yorkshire, with warring factions, Doncaster, Rotherham, Barnsley and Sheffield, is now being glued together through investment zones. And without that local leadership and glue, there's no chance of local growth. It appears to exist. Secondly, South Yorkshire now has an industrial strategy. Indeed, everywhere needs an industrial strategy. I would argue the world is falling over itself right now in the generation of industrial strategies, and we are at risk and have already, to an extent, fallen behind by dint of not having had one. David spoke to this. The East has been at this game for at least 2 decades. The West is belatedly being stirred from its slumber. The UK is still playing catch-up. In South Yorkshire, it's rooted around advanced manufacturing. David spoke about that as well. Indeed, rooted in the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in just outside Sheffield, which is a partnership between government and business. It's been in place, actually, for getting on for 20 years, but is just establishing wings. It is those wings that will establish regeneration in the wider region. Third, heritage. Heritage really matters if you are to bind in local citizens. But the key thing is to be respectful of heritage but not bound by heritage. Really important everywhere, including where I was yesterday in South Yorkshire. It's symbolic that the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, the AMRC, is based where? It's based in Orgreave, which for the older members of the audience, which certainly include me, was the place where the Battle of Orgreave during the miners' strike took place, of real symbolic significance. But now they're looking forwards rather than backwards as an advanced manufacturing site. Point 4 is about the importance of anchor institutions, both institutions and anchors. The reason I'm optimistic about South Yorkshire and indeed elsewhere is because it is an alliance, I'm going to disagree a bit with Deirdre here, of anchor institutions that straddle all sectors. It, of course, that includes central government. The Chancellor was up in Sheffield yesterday launching the investment zone with a slug of central government money. It includes local government, the importance of local mayors and local council leaders. It includes business. Boeing yesterday was putting a big slug of money into a regeneration of further arm of AMRC. Also there is McLaren there is Rolls-Royce there is GKN there's 120 industrial partners. And also there is the local universities, both Sheffield University and Hallam University, as part of that partnership, public, private and civil society, that for me is the absolute seed corn of regeneration success. 1 minute left, thank you very much. Final point, the public realm, the cultural realm. On that site is being built 4,000 new houses. On that site are being built new green spaces, a key point in attracting people in and keeping them in. If those are the core ingredients, some of which are there in Sheffield already, in South Yorkshire, some of which are being built, what are the missing ingredients in my remaining 45 seconds? I'll mention 4, 10 seconds each. The first of which is that devolution has yet to run its course. It's currently, for my money, still rather half-hearted, has far further to go in emboldening and empowering local leaders. Secondly, transport infrastructure is pathetic in this country at both the local and the national level. It's only 5 miles away from the city centre, the AMRC, but there's no train there, and the buses run at best at peak times twice per hour, if indeed they run at all. And don't get me started on national infrastructure, by the way. If you want to try and get between any of our cities at any speed, good luck with that one. We have built the world's first ever intercity network, which actually does not connect any cities. At huge cost. Sorry, Tim, I know as part of the National Infrastructure Commission, I should have views on that, Tim. Third, finance. Tim mentioned the Macmillan report. The Macmillan gaps are chasms in South Yorkshire. That's why no big business has a home venue. And last, but by no means least, that speaks to stuff that Deirdre's been speaking about over many long years, which is the importance of narrative and stories. Every place needs a story about themselves. Every person needs a story about themselves, and a story that's not looking backwards and down, but rather is looking forwards and up. We still miss that across many places in the UK. Until we have that positive narrative, we will not have positive growth. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. So there's lots of interesting points being raised, but I think I'm going to allow them to come up in the way we interact with the audience rather than my trying to bring them out. I should say, though, that my heart is warmed by your reference to Sheffield, which is my hometown, where my family have historically in mining and steel making, as you might expect, but their main contribution to the economy of Sheffield was in professional football and becoming publicans after that. So not perhaps the sectors one thinks of as necessarily the important ones. But Okay, so what I'm going to do is just thanks. I'm going to just look to the audience now to make comments, and then I might use that to try and provoke a bit of interaction with the panel. So I'll go here and here. I'm going to collect them in three. So I'm going to take the three near the front, and I'll compensate by going to the back in a moment. So, Adrian, you caught my eye first.
Can I ask a question of David Sainsbury? Sorry. This is a question of David Sainsbury. I don't think Singapore is remotely a tyranny, but it's certainly not a democracy. Do you think serious economic growth in this country is compatible with democracy?
Okay, growth and democracy. Good punchy question. And we'll take three. Okay.
Thanks very much. I'm heavily biased because I run a think tank about building resilience to extreme risks like pandemics and artificial intelligence and potential challenges. And my question is, if the aim is to rekindle Britain's economic flame, how do we make sure that we're not having those aims swept away by extreme risk events happening in the way that we've seen with COVID-19, but also how do we do that optimistically and not just kind of bring this in as a problem? What's the optimistic vision for managing those risks with the aim of a growing economy? Thank you.
Okay, and then the third was just here. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Lee Waters. I'm a Minister of the Welsh Government. I don't think optimism is quite going to cut it, really, and I'm frustrated by the second panel discussion we've now had with no mention of the inbuilt instability we know we have from climate change. There's a mention last night of it being a constraint in Whitehall, but other than that, even if you are a climate skeptic, which I realise there are people here who are, the change to our climate is already baked in. Is going to cause extreme economic instability. It's been 15 years since Stern Report predicted a 5% annual drop in GDP, and the science has only hardened since then. So it seems to me it is happening, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And I don't know how we can have a discussion about the next 50 years without talking about it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to join the latter two questions. Both had a common theme in a way. They're about resilience, instability, in particular the threat of climate change. And then we had the challenge, how does this all work in a democratic framework? Can we have growth and democracy? So who would like to, it seems like everyone wants to come in. So I'll start with Deirdre, I'll go to Anton, then I'll come back to David, and then we'll see how we go.
I don't think the science on climate change is quite baked in the way you say it is. It's changed. And it's changed in a moderately, I'm concerned about climate change, in a moderately optimistic direction. I don't mean it's not happening, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that through, not we, but you and me, we're finding small solutions or large ones, and they're happening. That's the engineering consensus. On artificial intelligence, I just wrote a column about it. I'm the world's expert on artificial intelligence, so I'll tell you what I think. Artificial intelligence is as old as humans. Language is an artificial intelligence machine, for example. It has all the characteristics except physical instantiation that artificial intelligence has. The old joke in the humanities is, do we speak the language or does language speak us? And more to the point of our discussion this morning, the economy is an artificial intelligence machine, by which I mean an economy in which you and I make decisions about our life and an order emerges for good or bad.
Anton.
So right above me it says lessons from the past. And so one thing that I think is really interesting about resilience, and I do take resilience very, very seriously, is there is actually a really good historical kind of analogy to look into in some detail, which is the fall of the Dutch Republic, Now, the Dutch Republic has this golden age from about the 1580s to about 1650, 1660. And suddenly, in 1650, 1660, everything goes terribly wrong. I mean, literally everything goes wrong. They get very soon invaded by the French, goes awfully. They have their disaster year in 1672. Their fertility rates suddenly decline, the population stagnates, they start getting all sorts of environmental disasters, their various rivers start silting up, various dams start breaking, there are huge floods. It's almost apocalyptic kind of stuff. You know, they have, there's a huge cattle, like they basically have their version of foot and mouth disease at the same time. You know, they become quite reliant on their agriculture, become reliant on that. There's massive fall in the cities. I mean, it literally deurbanizes, despite already being the most urban society in the world, and deindustrializes all at the same time over the course of a very slow decline of about 100 years. So there is a kind of a lesson there. And yet, in 1776, when Adam Smith writes about countries around him that are doing well, he talks about the Dutch as having reached a certain level, a very high level of opulence, and something to look into. I do think those things are to be taken seriously, and one of the issues that the Dutch Republic faced is that it constantly has to ramp up taxes to try and deal with a lot of these issues. But it's very difficult to imagine a situation in which the Dutch Republic could have survived at all, let alone maintained a level of opulence 100 years on from the beginning of all this kind of slow managed decline, had it not already become quite wealthy in the first place. That's not to say that growth is the kind of golden ticket out of a lot of disasters, but it certainly helps if you have a lot of wealth that you can start spending on mitigating against future disasters and start planning for them too, right? Because even planning for them, you know, if we think of things as being kind of insurance schemes, that takes resources, and it's very well worth doing that.
So, David.
I think I was asked a question whether industrial policy is compatible. Industrial policy is compatible with democracy. I don't see any reason why not. I mean, this is something that is agreed between industry asking, this is our plan to do this, and we want government support, and government can give support. There's no reason why that is incompatible with democracy. And Singapore is not the kind of ideal on this, but it is actually still a democracy. They happen to continue to vote for them. I don't think that there's anything that says you can't have an opposition. And of course, what they do have is the great advantage that the same people, by and large, continue to run it, as opposed to our system, where we have a change of minister and government pretty well every kind of few weeks. And that is not good for trying to have an industrial policy. But I can't see any reason that these two are incompatible. On climate change, I think the point that needs to be made there is that climate change and the green industries are one of the real future opportunities for economic growth. And you can see that in our wind turbine industry, which was actually a rather good example of industrial policy. What we should be doing is seizing those opportunities which climate change produces, and as part of industrial strategy to make it work. So I don't think it should be left out. It's a way we can create high-valued jobs in the future.
Excellent. So let me just make one comment that joins up the two sets of questions. If you look at one very robust statistical fact, which I don't think is well known, is to look at instability and whether you're democratic or not. So one thing is very, very clear in the data, that you get very high-performing autocracies. Think, we can debate Singapore, whether that is or not. Singapore, South Korea during its early industrialization. But you also get all the low performers. What you buy by being democratic is a huge shrinkage in the distribution of performance across a whole range of indicators. And actually, we're already beginning to see that in the climate area. So I did a report for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank last summer, which showed exactly the countries that are acting. You're getting the same pattern. You've got the autocracies that are just ignoring this. You've got a few, China again, that are a big time worrying about this. But on average, the democracies are doing far more in that space. So I think we should think of democracy not just in terms of do you get more or less growth, but actually do you buy yourself a certain degree of insurance or resilience. And democracies are just much more resilient. And I think you can see that across a whole range of policies. And so we mustn't just think in terms of average growth rates. Okay, I'm going to go to the sort of back of the room to begin with. I'll go right to the back, actually, to begin with. And then I'll sort of work across the back. 3 questions again.
Hi, I'll try and keep this brief. I just wondered why we think it is that we're so obsessed with high-vis and hard hats and digging holes in the ground, and not talking enough about the fact that, for example, there are women in this country, and it does predominantly affect women, who cannot afford to go to work. Can't afford to go to work. It's pointless them going to work. I was in that situation practically myself, and I had a good job where I earned the grand sum of £400 cash a month. And I stuck with it, and I listened to Sheryl Sandberg, who said lean in, and I'm really glad I did. But for many women, they do not have that choice. And I don't understand why we don't talk about it more, because their loss to the economy must have an impact on growth.
Right, thank you. I'll continue. I'll go right to the back there, and then I'll take this one in the middle here. Yeah.
Hi, Nicola Headlam. I'd like to start by thanking Andy Haldane for his contribution to the bright angelic Mills narrative rather than the dark satanic ones. I don't think anybody apart from Lord O'Neill of Gatley, where I live, has done as much in that space. I, for my sins, organised a summit in Rotherham with the Prime Minister and the mayors in 2018, and it was to sort of set the Northern Powerhouse strategy. It was a disaster in retrospect, because what had happened in between us thinking it was going to be a good plan and it happening was the election for December 2019 had been called, right? So the temperature between the Northern mayors and the Prime Minister, it was extremely difficult. And what I would like to say is, why is the work of institution building in the subnational, where actually the democracy and productivity thing could tie together beautifully, why is it so hard in this country?
Okay, finally, and I'll come. There was somebody just in the middle towards the back there. Yeah, there we are. Thank you.
Thank you. And it was very nice to actually have a mention of Sheffield's economic decline without the usually obligatory mention of the full Monty. So thank you to Andy for that. But even those of us who consider ourselves sort of economic liberals, sort of looking at the world today, seeing the sort of trend towards deglobalization, decoupling, a return of great power competition, and all the various other sort of temperature-raising things that we've seen on the horizon, does one have to accept that, even if we wouldn't like to admit this, and even if we think a free economy is one that functions the best, that even if you're not looking for industrial strategy at the moment, industrial strategy is looking for you, and that this is not a question simply of what can make an economy grow the fastest, but of simply sort of national security and preparing for an international environment that looks increasingly tasty. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to come to Andy, because actually you were implicated. So we have a question about gender and its role in this debate. We have a question about institutions, and we have a question about industrial strategy. So which of those you'd like to take, I don't know, and we'll spread that around the panel then.
Can I take all 3 really briefly?
Okay.
On the first one, absolutely. So economic growth, really easy. You get it either by growing your workforce or by making that workforce more productive. David spoke about productivity. We haven't spoken about the other bit, which is growing the workforce. The lucky story post-financial crisis is that for a while our workforce was growing. And that was in part a story about increased domestic participation, particularly by women, right? That reversed itself 3 or 4 years ago in the light of COVID. That's why there's 500,000 people fewer in the workforce now than was the case then. Should huge efforts be made, even bigger efforts be made, to get more people back in the workforce, particularly women? Absolutely. Are the child care reforms that were announced in the budget a step in the right direction, a down payment? Yes. is more needed? Absolutely. I would include not just women, by the way, older people. Most businesses are ageist, right? The jobs being offered, the 1 million unfilled vacancies in this country, most are not suitable for anyone my age, much less older. That is wrong and needs to change if we are to have that second cylinder of growth, the workforce cylinder, firing. Institutions, we have not valued them locally. The short story is we've failed to invest in them. We've hollowed them out over many years. Governments, red and blue, have done that. The tide stopped retreating, but for me is yet to fully turn and needs to if we are to make good on a place-based strategy, which for me is the seed corn then of a national strategy. And on all matters industrial policy, I'm tempted just to agree. Whether the rationale for that is beating back the climate crisis, or whether the rationale for that is strengthening the resilience of supply chains that we rely on for our essential goods. Both of those are equally good rationales for pursuing this course with force, as pretty much every country on the planet is now doing. It's engaged in an arms race. That arms race is positive for climate reasons, by the way. Most arms races aren't. This one is, because it's beating back a global externality. It's also of some value for reasons of domestic resilience. We need to be careful that doesn't sway into mercantilism and protectionism. That is a risk, but ultimately, this is a means by which we break free, for me, of that great stagnation that's the conference title.
Okay, so Anton indicated he'd like to come in. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something that's kind of bothering me, right? Which is that, and maybe this kind of speaks a bit to Deirdre's point as well, which is that a lot of things seem to be downstream of the fact that it's very difficult to just do things without some kind of political say. And I think I agree that in the current climate, given the way things are structured, it does make sense that you have devolved administrations, that you have more power perhaps for elected mayors in various regions, that you have various strategies and conferences and all of this kind of, narrative building and all of this stuff that happens. But ultimately, when you look back at how a lot of the infrastructure that we currently enjoy in this country today was built in the first place, it did not require any of that. Now, clearly something has happened along the way where we've created structures whereby we have to have political say in order to get anything built. Whereas before it was, well, I got to get coal from, from Northumberland further inland so that I can get some more grain from further inland. Let's go to Parliament, get a quick Act of Parliament to allow us to do that. Bish, bash, bosh. There's an economic case, it's done. Now, obviously, there might be more issues that need to be solved along the way. There may need to be another kind of restructuring that goes into that. I'm not saying it's an easy task to fix that. But it bothers me that so often we have this issue. And the same with housing. You mentioned that there's a local strategy, effectively, to build more housing. There shouldn't need to be a local strategy to build more housing. It should be that, as Sam Bowman was saying, I think so rightly yesterday, that you get building in response to energy prices. And the same with energy, right? That we've actually, funnily enough, back in the 1950s and 60s, this country was the world leader for nuclear fission. It was one of the first, and it was only just getting started, but it was the world leader for nuclear fission. And yet, we let the French get ahead of us. And now look who's benefiting, right? France, we're literally importing French nuclear energy all the time. And then the moment they have a problem with their reactors, it's like, uh-oh, we're in really big trouble because we're so reliant on that. Again, it seems as though we've kind of lost our ability to allow market forces to react in a kind of smooth way, because we've gummed up the system with so many things kind of along the way. And I think that's very much worth addressing. I'm not saying I have the answer to that, but I think it's the kind of way to be thinking about this.
Okay, so I think Deirdre and David both want to come in. I hope we'll get another round of questions, though, so if you could be very brief in your replies.
Well, I have the answer. I completely agree with Anton, which is get your hands off the economy. It's a terrible mistake to think of everything in terms of we. You start bringing we into it, and I object to my neighbor starting a shop, and then I have a say in it. As soon as you bring politics into it, you're going to get not in my backyard. It's impossible. I was on a panel at the National Theatre in London some years ago, and the audience was predictably red. The people's flag is scarlet red, and so forth. And I said, you know, the reason you have a housing crisis in London is planning permission. And they hissed me. Well, you know, as soon as you bring we in, you're doomed. Industrial policy, I'm sorry to say, is a terrible idea.
Okay, David, yeah, you might want to spend...
Can I just talk a little bit about industrial policy? Because it's a rather interesting question if you look at it historically. If you look at it historically, you find that the countries which are not leading get back to being a leading country by industrial policy. When they then get to a leadership position, they suddenly change and say, what we need is a totally free market. It's a perfectly rational thing to do, but it doesn't tell you that industrial policy is wrong. And if I can go back to this historical point about how did Britain become so successful in the Industrial Revolution, it's not true that at the time of the Industrial Revolution, we were purely an agricultural society. In fact, we were a very wealthy society based on wool manufacturing. And how was it that we were the world leaders in wool manufacturing? Well, actually, it was a Henry VII industrial policy. Henry VII, as I'm sure you know, was in his youth, was exiled to Brittany, and he there saw what was happening to the Flanders. Flanders was then a very wealthy society because of its ability to weave woolen garments. And he saw that the woolen garments were made from British wool, and that was the basis of their success. And so he came back to England, became king, and said that he was, the country was in a terrible way borrowing money from the Italian bankers. We've got to get out of this. And he had an industrial policy which was to turn this country into a great woolen manufacturing country. And he did that. Classic industrial policy. He stopped manufacturing woolen garments coming into this country. He got the Flemish weavers to come over to England to teach us the skills, and he put a tariff on wool being exported, which did in some of the other countries. That was classic industrial policy, and it's why we, in the period before the Industrial Revolution, were extremely wealthy based on woolen manufacture. And if you go to the House of Lords, you'll see that the Speaker sits on the wool sack. Why was he sit on the wool sack, which is a sack of wool? Because that was a symbol of our wealth. Now again, if you look at America, America didn't become wealthy as a purely liberal democracy. People forget that Hamilton was very keen on tariffs and had a tariff policy, and up to the end of the Second World War, America had strong tariffs to keep out foreign goods and protect its own markets. It's only at the end of the Second World War, when America has complete world domination and success, that suddenly it says, no, 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 this is a terribly bad thing. We have to get rid of all these tariffs and have completely free trade. So just look across the world, this idea that free markets is what has led to success is not true. Almost all the developing countries we've seen come forward have had some kind of industrial policy. When you become the leading country, of course, then your position changes. So if we're going to have a serious approach to try and get back into wealth, we've got to actually drop this idea that somehow the way you become wealthy is just purely by a market economy. I'm for a market economy. That's basic to the whole thing, but you need also to have collaboration between industry and government.
No, you're against a market economy, And
No, I've spent all my life in the market economy.
You want to go back to mercantilism. That's what you want, and that's what industrial policy is. We're reestablishing what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, my heroes, were arguing against. And it's going to kill economic growth, and it has repeatedly.
It'd be nice to go back one more round from the audience. I've got loads of hands. I've spotted 3. I'm going to go here, here, and then at the back there, and then I'm afraid that's all we've got time. I'll be really brief, please. So down here first. Who's got the mic?
Okay, I'll try and get rid of my 5 bullet points and get it down to 1.
Yeah, give one, only one, please.
So a lot was lost in the economic crash of 2008, but one of the things that has stood out for me, I got my dream job then to be Professor of Innovation in the West Midlands. We had a great plan to increase the GDP. It didn't work out because the money disappeared. What has changed in the last 15 years is the amount of gateways and the amount of people who think they know what to spend innovation money on, and the amount of turnstiles and hurdles any individual has to go through to get 10p, let alone 5 million. And I'm saying this as a university professor and as someone who worked in innovation at the BBC for 15 years. The only fund I can see in the UK that allows a single professor or a small team to do what they want in terms of research without telling you in advance what it's going to be and without telling you what the results are going to be is the Wellcome Fund. And honestly, that is a huge problem for this country.
Okay, thank you. Here, again, very brief.
So I was very surprised here in Churchill College of all to hear a panel with so many economic historians talking about what made Britain rich that didn't mention the empire and that didn't mention what Britain did to India. That seems a large omission. If you have evidence, Deirdre, on optimism in climate science, I'd love to see it. I'm a climate economist. It doesn't exist. The science surprises the downside.
Thanks very much. Great point. And then finally, at the back there, where the hand is, that's good. And apologies to everyone else. I know there's a huge number of hands.
Thank you very much. I'm Alison Rankin-Frost. Andy, you've given some great examples about how central planning of transport hasn't worked, and then you've talked also about strategy in regions. But how do you pick the right strategy? How do you know that your plan for essentially war is the right strategy? And on heritage, my background's from Northern Ireland. How do you know that you're picking the correct side in heritage? How do you know where your boundaries are? And I mentioned I'm in business, so I find often that when you ask a business what its important things are and what its strategy is about, mostly they talk about ESG. They've forgotten what their purpose is, and their purpose is not ESG. That should be a hygiene factor. They need to focus on what they actually do and where they add value.
Okay, so no small 3 questions to end on, but this will be the end. Andy, why don't you take the last question, since it was more or less directed at you, and then somebody might want to comment on the bureaucratic institutions that support all of this, and then finally someone might want to talk about empire in 30 seconds. Okay, Andy.
I'll be very brief. So on the last question, and heritage, the words I used were being respectful of, which is really important, particularly in Northern Ireland, a place I know well, but not bound by. And for me, that is key to moving ahead, wherever that might be. On transport, what I'd say was this, my evidence base is what has happened internationally. And what has happened internationally when it comes to go-go growth is that it comes from turning your cities into megacities. The UK has a second city problem because it has, outside of London, no real megacities, and local transport is a big reason for that. And indeed, looking ahead, the real next frontier is not megacities, it is mega regions, of which the US now has about a dozen, of which China now has about 30, and of which we have now 0. Which is why I underscored the importance of intercity connectivity to turn what are currently isolated, often city nodes, into a genuine UK network. That will not happen as long as there's no way of getting between our cities in less than 3 or 4 hours.
Okay, does anyone want to take the question about the landscape of support for people who want to do work?
Shall I deal with bureaucratic funding?
Yes. Yeah.
Having been science minister, this is kind of a field of knowledge. I think if you look at research councils across the world, as a whole, the British model is a pretty good one of research funding of grants, as opposed to what used to be the Italian model, which just the projects are sent to the minister and the minister agrees them. I think it's become more bureaucratic since we've had a layer on top of the research councils, and that's made it more bureaucratic. And we should get rid of UKRI bureaucracy on top of the research councils, because that hasn't helped. I think also, in a particular circumstances, the UK funding system breaks down. Where it breaks down is where you've got an area very rapidly developing, and there you want to fund institutions and not projects, of which the laboratory of molecular biology is the classic case. So I think there's modifications can be done on that, and you can get rid of some of the bureaucracy of UKRI, but the basic system, I think, is fairly good. And can I just talk on the Indian Empire? Yes, of course, Indian Empire was one of the ways that we created our wealth. India, in fact, before the period of the empire, was really quite a wealthy country internationally. We went in, and one of the bases of our colonial influence was we discouraged them doing manufacturing. We took the raw material back to England, we manufactured the goods and then sold them back to India, with the result that by the time we left, India was one of the poorest countries, having been one of the wealthiest. So there's no question that part of colonialism was, in fact, effectively exploitation of those countries.
So, Deirdre, we're in negative territory time-wise, so if you could just be brief, please.
I'm not in favor of slavery. I'm not in favor of empire. I'm not in favor of male domination. But I don't think that any of those, the exercise of any of those, made people rich. It's not correct historically that India was rich before the Raj or before John Company. That's simply false. It is not the case that Europe became rich by stealing from the rest of the world. I mean, if you're going to steal from someone, steal from a rich country. Steal from France. Don't steal from some poor country in Africa. That's not going to do you any good. This charge from the left that the world is zero-sum essentially, and that we only got rich by taking from other people is bad as economics and as history. It didn't happen.
Okay, well, thanks. I mean, we've certainly rekindled a lot of flames here in terms of interesting debates and discussions. So the panel has been super successful in all dimensions, I think. The number of hands that unfortunately I couldn't come to was also indicative of how much stimulus there must have been out there from these really fascinating comments by all of the panel. And I hope you'll join with me in thanking them for their insights and